The purpose of this video is to prepare you for the in-flight portion of your private pilot flight test. So I'll be the first one to tell you to read this flight test guide to prepare, but the guide itself is not really written in a way to help you create a mental picture for what the test is going to be like. So I'm going to walk you through how I would prepare someone for the test. None of this is a secret. All of this information that I'm going to present to you is found in the flight test guide that is published by Transport Canada for free online. So grab your favorite chair and a pencil and preferably a copy of the PPL Flight Test guide printed, and let's chair fly this together. At the end of the video, we're going to review the 4-point marking scale and how all of this preparation will get you to a successful flight test. We're going to start by assuming that you've passed the ground portion and you are walking towards the plane, meaning that you're going to be starting with the pre-flight startup and then operation of systems. For the pre-flight inspection, if you have a checklist, please follow that checklist. And what you're doing is you're just proving to the examiner that you know how to verify that the airplane is in fact airworthy. Once you have completed the walk-around, be prepared that the examiner will ask you specific questions regarding what to do if you find a defect or unsatisfactory item. Examples I can think of is if you found one of the tires was flat or if you realized one of the lights was burnt out. So they specifically want to know if you would ground the aircraft or how you would rectify the situation. And that depends on if you're at a school that has a policy or if you're a private owner to make an appropriate entry into the journey logbook and have it rectified prior to taking the aircraft for its next flight. This is the criteria for how you're going to be graded on your pre-flight inspection, and keep in mind that when they ask about fuel, they'll probably want to know how much fuel you have in terms of endurance, hence hours of flight, and not just how many gallons you have. And of course, here it is where they would like you to tell them what you do if you found an unsatisfactory item or defect. And just stop before you get into the plane. Remember, you do have to give your examiner a passenger briefing. They should remind you, but it's better if you can remember as well. This is very important. It's part of the performance criteria. It's right here at the bottom. And you can screenshot this page, or you can just pull it directly from the flight test guide, write down your own script, make your own checklist. Just make sure that this does not get missed. This is important because you'll soon be pilot in command of your own ship and you will need to provide all this information that's actually in the cars. So that's why they have it outlined for you. It's very important that you do provide this, and if you did want to have it handy for the future, to make your own checklist or your own script for a passenger briefing is not a terrible idea. Not only do they want you to brief on the items in the cars, but they also want you to provide an emergency briefing or tell your passenger what to do in the event of an emergency. And this will help you on the forced approach. You're going to have to brief your passenger on how to prepare for an emergency landing at some point. So why not just give it to them there right after you give them the safety briefing? So as an example, in the event of an emergency landing, this is how I'd like you to prepare, and then give them your script. This is mine written below. You don't have to do it this way, but this is just how I like to do it. Then, of course, they're going to watch you start the engine and do your run-up, and they're also evaluating your use of the checklist. So if you have a checklist, be sure to follow it. They'll also ask you what you're going to do if you find something unsatisfactory in the run-up. Safety should also be your first priority. So when you are starting your engine or doing your run-up, just make sure that you check both around the propeller and also behind you to make sure that you're not blasting anything behind you as you start the engine and or do the run-up. During this process, the examiner will probably ask you practical questions about your aircraft systems and have you explain it to them. Here are some of the items that they're going to ask you about, so just make sure you go through the list and be prepared for any questions on any of those items. The next thing you'll get graded on likely is your taxi, so they'll grade you on your ability to taxi the aircraft smoothly. If there are windy conditions, they will expect you to have the right aileron and elevator inputs, but if it is a calm day and there is no wind, the examiner might actually specify the speed and direction to evaluate you appropriately. So things they're looking for on the taxi are obviously wind inputs as well as your instrument roll check, and this could be as simple as your wings right, ball left, increasing, just checking to make sure that your instruments are giving you the right indications before you go for a flight. This is what the grading criteria looks like from the flight test guide. I'm not going to go into too much detail on this. Just remember to do your brake test before you start taxiing, taxi on the line, do your wind corrections, taxi slowly, do your instrument roll check, do not drag the brakes, and keep your eyes out for hazards. But just wait, before you start taxiing towards the threshold of the runway, there's one more thing you need to cover. Prior to departure, you're going to need to give the examiner a takeoff and departure briefing. If you taxi over to the threshold of the runway and then try to give the briefing there, you might just create a traffic jam. So before you even leave the run-up bay or your parking spot or start taxiing towards the threshold, please give your examiner a departure briefing. An example of a departure briefing could be the following: where you're going, from where, and also what your configuration is supposed to be for the takeoff, what your departure procedure is going to look like, what time you're going to be leaving and what time you expect to arrive at your destination, and then what you're going to do in the event of an emergency, either before takeoff, at low level after takeoff, or at more altitude after takeoff. I would recommend scripting and practicing your takeoff and departure briefing to make sure that it covers all of these points. Okay, now that you've briefed your examiner, you can start taxiing out, but before you do, just make sure that you are actually mentally ready for the flight test. You've got your situational awareness out and ready to go. Remember that it's your flight test, so you don't necessarily want to take too much time on getting ready, but you don't want to rush into anything either, because if you do happen to make a mistake, it might continue to bother you for the rest of the flight test and throw off your performance. Moving on to the departure and en route portion of the flight test. So again, we're going to cover points from the takeoff we haven't mentioned before yet, pilot navigation for departure, and the en route portion of the flight test. For the purpose of the private pilot flight test, you will need to demonstrate 2 takeoffs during your test. One will be a normal takeoff, one will be a soft field or a short field takeoff. We've already done the briefing components, so we don't have to worry about that. And if you are intending to vary your airspeed on takeoff, you have to give the examiner a reason for why you are doing so. As you can see here, here's the grading criteria for the takeoff, so they do want to make sure that they're able to grade you on your proper airspeed control during the takeoff and through the departure. Departure procedure is where things can get messy if you're not prepared in advance. So this is why I'm trying so hard to make this video for you so that you have all the steps you need to ace this part of the test. What they want to see from you is that you fly your flight plan. They want to see that once you take off, you used an organized method to intercept your first set heading point on your flight plan. They want you to note the time, and then they want you to estimate your ETA for the next destination. So the examiner expects you to be able to depart your local airport, complying with ATC procedures, using an organized method to get yourself onto your intended course or track or set heading point. And then once you're there, they want you to provide them with an updated ETA. Next is the en route portion of your flight test. So again, just fly your flight plan. You're not allowed to use radio aids or GPS in the execution of this exercise. For the en route portion of the flight test, I'm going to ask for 3 very specific things from you. 1 is to confirm that your aircraft has achieved its cruise performance that you planned for. 2 is that you figure out where you are in your track and you revise any headings as appropriate. And 3, you give me an updated ETA with the potential fuel burn and what our remaining fuel is in endurance. For point number 1, you're showing the examiner how you set up the airplane for the cruise performance that you had planned for in your flight plan. So you set the power accordingly and then calculating based on the outside air conditions and the current pressure altitude. You confirm your indicated airspeed and that you are getting the performance you planned for in your flight plan, which is going to give you the idea of your fuel burn and your intended ground speed. In order for the examiner to evaluate you correctly on this, your next step is to maintain exactly your altitude that you planned for and your heading that you planned for. So plus or minus 200 feet, plus or minus 10 degrees on the headings. One of the reasons that this is important is because in the next step, you're going to assess how well your flight plan is working for you by doing a ground speed check and a position check. If you're watching this video during the navigation part of your flight training, you should be using a navigation flight log like this one. And in my navigation video, I gave you a recipe for kind of what checkpoints to have while you're practicing your cross countries. So if you're doing this during the cross country part of your training, it shouldn't be something unfamiliar to do. And it would be a good idea to get started doing this so that when you go about it in your flight test, it feels natural to you. For example, if you've flown to your first ground speed check point and you verified your position by noting where you are on the map, then if you have your 10-degree drift lines drawn out, they can help you to determine how to adjust your heading. So for example, in this case with this airplane, you can say, I can see that we are over the river and not over the North Shoreline like our plan takes us. Our position is here and we are approximately 5 degrees off course. I'll adjust my heading to the north until we regain track, and then I'll adjust it again until my next checkpoint. That's basically all you need to do to satisfy the second item for the en route ground speed check. You've verified your position on the map and your ground speed compared to what you planned for, and you've come up with a plan to systematically correct for it. Lastly, you should provide an updated ETA. So if you have your flight plan handy, you should already know what you're supposed to be doing for ground speed during this flight. Simply compare the crossing times to what you planned for and provide an updated ETA and fuel remaining for the journey. So by doing those 3 things, now you've satisfied the 3 requirements that I have for the en route portion, which is to, within 15 minutes, verify that you are going to reach your destination at your assumed ETA and that you do have enough fuel. After you're completed the navigation portion, you're probably at altitude, meaning that you may as well start going into your upper air work, which would include all of the items listed below. The first exercise I'll probably start with is the steep turn. Very easy exercise, just one 360-degree turn to the left or to the right to roll out on the exact same heading as you started in at the same altitude that you started in. This exercise should also be done in reference to a geographical point that the examiner will pick out for you, or you might have picked out on your own. What I want you to remember in doing the steep turn is that they're trying to make sure that you keep your eyes in an effective lookout through the entire maneuver, i.e. that you're not fixating your eyes on the instruments to make sure that you're staying within the parameters, which is altitude, airspeed, and angle of bank. They do want you to visually kind of roll out on that heading, so make sure you lock your eyes on that geographical reference and maintain coordination through the maneuver. In teaching steep turns, I'll often use the script look, step, roll, pitch, power, because what it does is it reminds your brain what to do in what order to make sure that you're not missing any steps in order to maintain that turn in coordination. When you're rolling out on your heading, also remember that you're going to have to coordinate that. So reverse these in your rollout to make sure that you roll out on heading and stay coordinated. From there, we can move into slow flight, where you will be maneuvering the aircraft within 5 to 10 knots of its stall speed. Intermittent stall warnings are okay. You don't need the stall horn going the entire time you're doing this exercise. And if you do need to increase speed slightly in the turn, you are allowed to do so. And of course, as always, before you start to begin these maneuvers, you're going to want to do something very important, which is your safety check. For the safety check before you do slow flight or stalls, I've seen it taught in different ways at different schools. There are a couple different ways that people teach it, but essentially the idea is the same. And you're answering the question for the examiner, is it safe to begin to do these maneuvers, right? So are you high enough? Has your aircraft been checked? And have you done a call to warn other traffic in the area? And have you done an effective lookout? I've heard that the 90-90 turn or a 180-degree turn will both be sufficient for this exercise, but just answer the question, is there anyone around? Are we at sufficient height? Can we safely do this maneuver? For the rest of the performance criteria, you're looking at, so you've done your safety lookout, now you have to essentially demonstrate straight and level flight in slow flight at the configuration determined by the examiner, prevent a stall, and then you need to execute one turn with an angle of bank of 15 degrees in slow flight. Some tips for this exercise is obviously you do want to enter and exit at the same altitude. If you do lose or gain altitude in this exercise, get it back right away. Maintain a lookout, so don't just stare at the gauges. Your instructor wants, or your examiner is going to want to make sure that you still are looking for traffic, even though you're in a really nose-high position for safety reasons. And then they want you to maintain coordination at all times. Keep your feet active on that rudder and do not start cross-controlling in the turn. I've seen that before. So remember, if you feel that tilt in the wings, just pick it up with the rudder, not with the aileron, because they're not going to have as much effectiveness. And then the last tip is, because the radius of your turn is so tight, if you don't start the rollout about 10 to 20 degrees before your actual heading that you need to roll out on, you'll tend to blow through it. So just be mindful of that when you're practicing these. From the slow flight maneuver, if it was executed properly, I might just bring the student directly into a power on stall. Your examiner might not do this, but if they do, just don't be surprised, because you're already relatively configured for it. You've done a safety check to ensure that you're safe to begin this maneuver. And so all you'd have to do from this position of slow flight is essentially slowly raise the nose to bring it into a stall. I do say slowly because you don't want to enter this exercise in an excessively nose-high attitude, and if you pull too rapidly to bring it into the stall at this point with power on, that's exactly what you're going to do. So just very slowly back on the yoke and bring it slowly into a power on stall. In the performance criteria for the stall, of course, they do want you to maintain a lookout, but they also want you to recognize and announce. And may I point out that this is actually in bold in the flight test guide. So once you do recognize that you are in a stall, whether you get the uncommanded pitch, uncommanded roll, or VSI going negative, recognize it, but announce it as well to the examiner to let him know that you are aware that it has stalled, and then an immediate recovery. Do not enter a spin. From there, the examiner might get you to demonstrate a power off stall, or they might evaluate that in the unusual attitudes exercise. We'll talk about that in a second, but just remember, in a power off stall, you are less likely to get a nose drop and more likely to get just the buffeting sensation. So be very keenly aware of when that stall actually occurs and be sure to announce it. As I said before, if you feel like you're being rushed, just take a minute to reset. The flight test is not a race. Like, don't take too much time on it. But if you feel like you need to take a minute to get set up properly for the exercise, take that extra 30 seconds. Once you've completed those two items, we can move on to instrument flight, which includes unusual attitudes and your basic instrument flying. You'll most likely begin with the full panel flight, meaning that you have access to all of your instruments, but just not outside reference. For this exercise, you will have to maintain straight and level flight for 2 minutes, followed by a rate 1 turn. Before you enter the turn, please ask the examiner if it is clear because you'll be under the hood and unable to check for traffic. Once you've done the rate 1 turn, you will be expected to fly for another 2 minutes straight and level, maintaining the performance criteria shown below. The next exercise you'll probably do is recovery from an unusual attitude, and in this exercise the examiner is going to take control, tell you to close your eyes, and then put the airplane into an unusual attitude. And we know for the PPL level it's either going to be a nose up or a nose down with bank, meaning that it's either going to be an approach to stall or entry into a spiral dive. So knowing that, your job is to, upon their command, open your eyes and recover just back to straight and level flight. So the examiner is going to be assessing your ability to recognize the unusual attitude and correct appropriately. Now remember that the correction for an approach to stall and recovery from a spiral dive are not the same in terms of their sequence. So make sure that you are able to recognize and recover with the correct sequence no matter what scenario they give you. Remember that because this exercise is done under the hood, the only tools that you have are your flight instruments to tell you what scenario the examiner has given you. They would like to see the recovery done in the correct sequence, and the only thing they want to see you do is recover back to straight and level flight. Next, we're going to move into lower air work, which includes your forced approach, your precautionary, and your diversion. And in between those items, I'm going to do 2 exercises with you to make sure that you get evaluated on them, which is slipping and overshooting. So the forced approach is the first one we're going to start with. It's a bit of a special exercise because it's actually evaluated in 2 parts. So if you look at the evaluation sheet for the private pilot flight test, you'll notice that there are 2 sections. There's the actual approach, and then there's the cockpit management section. For the evaluation piece, they're going to be giving you this exercise at 3,000 feet above ground, not any lower, and they're going to be assessing your choice of landing spot, and they also are going to be assessing that you are putting it down in the first third of the landing spot, just to determine your accuracy in this exercise. In their evaluation of you in this exercise, they're going to watch that you put the plane into its best glide speed, fly an organized approach, and be able to land it with a level of precision in your intended landing spot. There are a couple things I want to talk about with regards to the evaluation of the forced approach. Making your field is very important, and so it's just as important to not overshoot your field as it is to not undershoot your field. The examiner can take you as low as he wants to take you in order to prove to you whether or not you were able to touch down in your selected touchdown zone, which should be ideally the first third of your suitable landing spot that you chose. So just make sure that you practice this enough on your own to be prepared for that in the flight test. The second thing I want to talk about is that you are able to vary your glide speed if you need to in order to make your selected touchdown zone. So the way you do this is that as soon as they say simulated engine failure, you pitch for your best glide airspeed, hold that airspeed as you do your approach. However, as you get closer, and I do recommend coming in a little bit high, just to make sure that you do not misjudge the winds and actually can make your selected touchdown zone. And then as you approach your selected field, you can put the plane into a slip to lose a little bit of altitude, and that is totally fine with regards to the grading of this exercise. The last thing is that you are allowed to change your field as long as you are still able to reach your original field. So if you do find on your approach that you could have selected a better landing site, you can change your landing site. It just, as long as your original landing site still could have been made. In my training video for the forced approach, I'm really specific on what I want for cockpit management. That's because you're going to be evaluated on your ability to do so. So carb heat on, pitch for best glide, these are your basic vital actions that you should be doing from memory so that you don't have to verify with a checklist. You can do the entire forced approach exercise without a checklist. It's good to have one just in case you forget anything, but if you have the process memorized, trust me, it's way better. Anyone who's watched an actual engine failure on a YouTube video or who has experienced one in real life knows that the last thing you're going to think about is pulling up a checklist. The first thing you think about is what you memorized in your training. So make sure that you demonstrate that you can do those things from memory. Perform a passenger emergency safety review. Again, in the start of this video, I told you that you could do it before you even get in the aircraft. This is why it's not a terrible idea, because this exercise can be a bit of a helmet fire. So if you have memorized it, which I highly recommend you do so, all you have to do is say it again to your passenger. Now, because Canada can get really cold in the wintertime, they do have this really special note. And this is an important note that if you are doing your flight test, say in cold conditions, on the forced approach, there is the potential for you to be shock cooling your engine, unfortunately. So because of that, because they because the examiner expects the candidate to recognize how to take proper control of the engine, they say in this note that if you want to, in order to prevent that shock cooling, you can leave a little bit of flap and some residual power to achieve a normal power off gliding descent angle and airspeed. So just some final notes on the evaluation of this exercise. They want to see your basic vital actions from memory. They want to see you make an appropriate radio call, obviously a simulated mayday call, perform a passenger emergency safety review, and if it's really cold out, they expect you to take care of your engine as required. Now that we've talked about the forced approach, one of the things I tell my students to do typically when they're doing their forced approach exercise is to intentionally come in a little bit high. And then that way, if you need to lose altitude, you can always execute a forward slip or a slipping turn to get the airplane in a suitable gliding distance from your intended touchdown zone. The other nice thing about this is it gets another exercise demonstrated to the examiner and it gets it nicely out of the way. One thing I want to make sure that you don't do is if you are going to do a forward slip or a slipping turn, that you do not do it with power on. The entire purpose of a forward slip or a slipping turn, remember, is to lose altitude. If you have power in, then in order to lose altitude, you could just remove your power. So if you're trying to demonstrate this on a landing with power in, doing a forward slip to lose altitude, your examiner is just going to be asking you why you're doing two things that are working against each other at the same time. One thing that goes without saying is be very, very careful when you do perform this maneuver that you don't unintentionally put the airplane into a skid. That is a very dangerous technique. And so if you are going to execute a forward slip, just take a second and make sure you're doing it correctly. Now, since you have to do an overshoot in order to finish the forced approach, I can't imagine that you won't get evaluated on it. So we're going to talk about that now. Important things to remember when conducting an overshoot are to add full power first and do not descend when conducting the overshoot. Only once a safe airspeed has been achieved, then you retract the flaps. Since you've executed a forced approach and we're now low to the ground in the overshoot, I'm probably going to get you to go into a precautionary landing exercise at this point. So this evaluation is to make sure that you are able to do essentially a low-level pass or a low-level inspection to investigate whether you could not only land on a certain chosen area, but also take off from it. So you have to get low enough and stable enough to be able to assess the landing surface to make sure that it is suitable for you to actually take off again from. This is the performance criteria for this precautionary landing. Well, it's a lot of material, so we're going to go through it slowly one by one. Because the precautionary landing is in response to a scenario that's given to you by the examiner, they're going to, depending on what the scenario is, they're going to assess you on whether you selected a suitable landing site for your airplane. You are going to be expected to comply with circuit procedures if the anticipated landing site is at an actual aerodrome. You're going to be expected to make appropriate radio calls or simulated. If you're doing, say, a pan-pan call, you wouldn't want to do the real thing. You're going to be expected to evaluate the wind conditions, landing surface, and obstacles. I have made an entire video on this, so I'm not going to go through that in this particular video. Establishing a circuit, a suitable distance, maintaining orientation. This is important if you're selecting an off-field landing area. Reviewing passenger safety. So again, your passenger briefings, don't forget them. And configure and trim the airplane for a low-level inspection at an airspeed adjusted for existing conditions as recommended by the POH. So some POHs actually have established conditions for low-level passes. However, if you're in the absence of that in the POH, typically it would be some degree of flap and some recommended airspeed that is a lower airspeed than cruise, but not an unsafe airspeed at all. Definitely not on the backside of the power curve. And then the really important thing, again, in this maneuver is you cannot descend in your inspection pass. They'll probably get you a 2 or a 1. So make sure that you're maintaining straight and level flight. Your choice of altitude for the inspection pass is really up to you. Just make sure that you communicate it to the examiner and don't descend during your inspection pass below what you say you're going to do it at. You want to get low enough so that you can actually get a reasonably good look at the landing surface and make a good assessment of whether or not you could actually land there. And if you don't think that it would be a good spot, consider going somewhere else for this exercise. You want to make sure that you maneuver the airplane to make it look as though you could actually land on that surface, and then you would be doing a soft field landing more than likely. So communicate that as well to the examiner and overshoot at a safe distance. And let's talk about everyone's favorite exercise, the diversion to an alternate. This exercise is highly not done well. Very often not done well. So we're going to talk about it in a bit of detail to make sure that you are doing well for your check ride. We'll talk about why this exercise can get a little bit messy. It's really testing your mental in-flight planning. You're not allowed to use any kind of CX3, E6B, notched pencils, nobody uses those anymore, or anything like GPS or ForeFlight to help you in this exercise. The very first thing you'll want to do when you start this exercise is to pull out your paper VNC chart. I'm not going to go through the full diversion exercise here because I've made an entire video on it, but for the purpose of the flight test, the examiner is probably going to give this exercise to you at a low level between 500 feet to 1,000 feet AGL, and they're going to expect you to pick out on the map where you are and then follow a set of geographical features such as roads to your chosen destination and provide an ETA. And this ETA is obviously not calculated in the same way that you did in the navigation exercise, but it should be estimated with some reason of accuracy. The way that you want to think about this exercise is basically it is like the navigation part of the flight test. It's just instead of having a flight plan that you made, you're going to be making one up in the air kind of on the fly, right? So you're going to be assessed in relatively the same way. You're still not allowed to use a GPS. You're still not allowed to use radio aids. You're basically using a paper chart and using what you know about distances and times and fuel burn and your airplane. You're going to give them a reasonable estimate of, what time you're going to reach that new destination and how much fuel you're going to have remaining. What I've heard about this exercise is that in the past they used to have candidates circle while they came up with a plan, and then once they had a plan they would turn and proceed on course. But I guess they decided that that took up too much time or used up too much fuel. So now what they want candidates to do is expedite their diversion. As soon as you find where you're going and where you are, they want you to essentially come up with the fastest way to get on track and get there. And then as you're en route there, that's when you start to come up with, your times and your fuel burn and your estimated ETA. If you really wanted to do well on this exercise, what you could do at home before your flight test is, knowing where your flight test is going to take place, go ahead and grab your paper chart and study it. Make sure that you know what the maximum elevation figures are along your selected routes or different routes that you could be diverted to, and circle them on your chart so that you're ready to talk about them. Another thing that you could do at home if you really wanted to do well in this exercise is go ahead and look up the different frequencies to talk to FIC, because if you're going to be talking to FIC during the flight, or at least simulating that you're going to be, why not put in the correct frequency? And then that way you can actually show the examiner that you know how to update your flight plan en route. Another thing you could do at home preparing is you could look up what your different fuel burn is going to be at different airspeeds. If the examiner gives you a low visibility diversion, you might want to select a lower airspeed just so that you have enough time to see and avoid, and that would actually give you a lower fuel burn. Just little things that you can do at home to prepare for this exercise so that you can just nail it. You are going to be expected to fly within reasonable parameters, so plus or minus 10 knots, plus or minus 200 feet. And again, you're going to have to provide an updated ETA. But what I want to emphasize the most when it comes to getting ready for your diversion exercise is that this is the one exercise that you can do at home anytime. All you need is your paper chart and just, throw a penny on the map and that's your location, and divert yourself to another airport. You do not have to be in the plane at all to practice this maneuver. And so if you take the time to go through a couple scenarios at home before your flight test, you might actually do really well in this exercise, and that's all it takes. So major steps when it comes to execution of this exercise, I've mentioned it before, grab your paper chart. Next, grab a pencil, circle, line, draw it on your map, right? And then find a way to get to your alternate destination. You want to write down your headings, your distance, and your time, maybe on the map or somewhere else, but just write them down so that there's not so many things happening in your head. Some people say write it on a lake or another area of your chart that's relatively, that's not so busy and would be easy to see what you're writing down. If you have a heading indicator that is not slave to your compass, take a second to reset it, because it's possible that as you turn onto your heading's actually not even accurate. So before you start this exercise and the execution of the diversion, reset your heading indicator to make sure that you're actually going the direction you want to go. Divide your distance to the destination into thirds, and then provide an updated ETA once you pass your first third. That way you get your updated ETA out of the way and you don't end up flying all the way to your destination with your examiner because you forgot that step. And then last things last is, of course, do you have enough fuel and what's your endurance? Once you are diverting, they might give you another emergency procedure to deal with. Your handling of an emergency will be assessed at some point during the flight test in the ground or in the air, and they're looking for two things. They're looking at how you're going to proceed with vital actions, and you can also follow up with an appropriate checklist. We'll talk about that in a second. So just for the record, it does say that one of the emergencies should be simulated while airborne, so this might come up in any point during the in-flight portion of the flight test, but they could also potentially ask you one or both of these questions on the ground. So since you're going to be evaluated on emergency procedures, and since you are able to use a checklist, now might not be a terrible time to make yourself a checklist for all of these potential scenarios, especially if they are something that could come up with your aircraft. We're almost done. We just need to talk about the arrival and landing, so we're not quite done yet. We need to talk about the circuit and landing procedures. Your circuit procedures are going to be evaluated, and in the event that your flight test takes place in an area where you cannot assess both a controlled and uncontrolled circuit approach, then through questioning, the examiner is going to determine whether you know what the procedures are and how to follow them in the area that cannot be assessed. Basically, just fly a circuit like you normally would, with the major evaluation criteria in this exercise being to maintain altitude within plus or minus 100 feet. So very tight on those circuit requirements, but that's for obvious reasons. And finally, your landing is going to be assessed, so we'll talk about what the criteria is for this. We'll start by talking about the normal landing. For the PPL level, you're going to be assessed on your ability to do a normal landing, and you're going to have to demonstrate either a short field or a soft field landing. And hopefully your overshoot's already been assessed in both the precautionary and the forced approach exercises. Also, for the purpose of your PPL flight test, you have to do all landings with full flap. This video wouldn't be complete without a note on the stabilized approach criteria, which is a really big deal in flight tests, and examiners are watching for this. So do me a favor, don't slip it down on final when you're actually doing your landings. You want to be stable by 200 feet AGL. So if you're coming in for a landing and the landing doesn't look good, overshoot, because you can't lose points by overshooting, but you can lose points if you continue to land after a destabilized approach. That's not good. When you're doing mental preparation for your flight test, thinking about the landings, specifically the short field and the soft field landing, I want you to practice each in very different ways, just knowing the key components of what makes a landing a short field landing and what makes a landing a soft field landing. So remember, for the short field landing, you're going for the slowest approach speed to have the minimal amount of energy once you do make that landing and into the rollout. I want you to pull the stick towards your belly as you're applying the brakes to protect that nose wheel. Otherwise, you're going to get a bad shimmy in the front wheel. I have heard that it is advised to retract flaps in order to get maximum braking pressure. However, I do feel like if you do that too rapidly, it just throws too much weight on the nose gear. So that's at your discretion. Make sure that you communicate your intentions to ATC if you do intend to stop on the runway. Usually they don't anticipate that. So depending on how you need to communicate it, make sure that you're letting everybody know that you intend to do a full stop after your landing. For the soft field landing, you want to think about protecting the nose gear at all times. It's really hard to simulate this kind of landing because when you're landing on a firm surface like a runway, you don't feel like you have to protect the nose from sinking into the ground, which could happen on a soft field landing, especially depending on how dry and how firm that soft field is. So do be sure that throughout the rollout, minimal use of the brakes, keep it rolling as much as you can, and leave the flaps down if that helps a little bit to keep that back pressure off the nose. It is sometimes a recommendation to add a touch of power into your landing just to soften that descent rate, right? So that's at your discretion. If as long as you can touch the airplane down in the most gentle way to avoid sinking into a soft surface. That's what the examiner is looking for, and they're very picky on that. So I said I'd come back to short and soft field takeoff. So again, when you're preparing for your flight test mentally at home, or even just sitting in the plane, running through your procedures mentally, you want to practice these in two separate ways. So for your short field, you remember that you're holding the you're holding the brakes while you're adding power, releasing the brakes to get that maximum performance. You want to rotate at the right time at the right airspeed, but trust me, you don't want to fixate on the airspeed indicator because you're going to go off center line. So as much as you can, maintain your outside focus as you do during the takeoff, but glance periodically or try to get a sense of when to rotate on these short field takeoffs, and then hold VX through the climb again, but not staring at the airspeed indicator. For the soft yield, you want that stick back through the whole procedure again. So from the taxi to the takeoff, they say in the flight test guide to avoid stopping, so try to keep it rolling. And then once you take off, de-rotate. And what I mean by that is don't push the nose down. It can really startle your instructor or examiner. You don't need to flatline it as soon as you take off. Just de-rotate slightly as you lift off the runway a little early because you've got flaps down, and just gain airspeed in ground effect before you rotate, and hold your airspeed as required. For these takeoff and landings, but also really specifically for the takeoff because you're in a nose-up attitude, is you want to make sure that you're not fixating on the gauges because you do need to maintain your centerline accuracy. They're grading you on that. This is a test, and so you're going to be graded in accordance to your performance on a 4-point marking scale. For the 4-point marking scale, that's how you're going to be evaluated. 4s are the best and 1s are a failure. So we're not going for perfection here. We are looking to help you pass your flight test. So if you get 1-1, it's not a big deal. You just have to repeat that item. Ways that you can get a 1 are if ever safety is in doubt. That's obviously a good reason that they would give you a 1. However, if you don't complete the aim of the objective, for example, if you do a steep turn, but you do it at 30 degrees the entire time, they're going to give you a fail. It could have been a beautiful steep turn, but the aim of the exercise was not achieved. One thing that does happen very often, however, is a student performs badly on their flight test, not because they're a bad pilot, but just because they get too nervous and they clam up. So make sure that you rehearse, and then when you go out for your flight test, just fly the aircraft, imagining that the examiner is your first passenger. The last thing I'm going to remind you of is please don't fixate on the instruments. Yes, they are useful, but at best they tell you what has happened, not what's going to happen. So do us a favor and use them as a reference only and not your primary guide for how you're doing. If you made it this far, thanks for sticking it out. And remember that I have a lot of other content on my channel that's specifically designed to help you pass your flight test. So thanks for being here. Good luck.